This week on When Builders Go Bad. No, it's not When Builders Go Bad, it's the Property Podcast. I'm Rob B with Rob D. But we will be covering when your build goes wrong. We will be covering if you fall out with your developer. And loads of other useful stuff too.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on the Property Podcast, where every single Thursday, property investors just like you come together to be informed and inspired. So much great information in our main topic this week. We've also got a pair of news stories, and stick around to the end for Hub Extra, where we've got an app that's going to make your life easier and save you some money.
So we've got two news stories of the week. They're linked. Now, the first one has a big, exciting headline that rents will be rising over the next 5 years by a whopping 15%. It sounds exciting, doesn't it? But once again, there's more than meets the eye when it comes to the headline.
Yeah, so this is reported in The Guardian, and it comes from a study done by RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, who predict that rents are going to rise by 15% over 5 years. And they've put this down to the tax changes that have been made, meaning that landlords are exiting the sector, therefore fewer rental properties, therefore higher demand, therefore higher rents. Now, I'm not going to argue with the fact that some landlords are leaving the sector because of tax changes. I'm sure they are, and I'm sure more will in the future. And I'm also not going to argue that rents aren't going to go up by 15% over the next 5 years, because I've got no data to show otherwise. Where I do think that this news story has taken a wrong turn, and made it more headline worthy to be fair, is by linking the two. So a rent rise of 15% over 5 years sounds pretty dramatic, but when you work it out, all that means is rents are going to go up by 2.8% per year compounded on average. And by an astonishing coincidence, inflation at the moment is round about 2.5% and is predicted to be somewhere in the range of 2.5% to 3% for the next 5 years. Therefore, all this news story actually seems to be saying is that rents will rise in line with inflation, which doesn't sound that headline worthy, and also isn't a major shock, Rob, in the light of another news story that we spotted this week.
Yes, this story reports that Allsops have looked at rent rises over the last 5 years, and guess what? They've rised in line with inflation. Wow, who would have guessed? So the last 5 years, rents have matched inflation, and the next 5 years, rents are probably going to match inflation. So, two news stories, but not a lot of news, because actually it's just doing what it probably should do. But there's a bigger lesson to take from this, is that you can take comfort, and Rob, I know you talk about this a lot, from the fact that rents do, over time, tend to follow inflation, sometimes beating it by a little bit. Whatever's happening in the market, whatever volatility up or down, rents are a lot more stable.
Yeah, and that's why, as investors, I think we should feel neutral and kind of quietly reassured by reports like this, because 15% over 5 years doesn't mean, oh, fantastic, this is going to be amazing, we should all pile in. But then if you look at it the other way and say, well, it's only going to match inflation, that's by no means a reason to be despondent. Having an inflation-linked income stream is fantastic. We've talked in one of the very earliest episodes about the hidden power of inflation, and I think it's such an important idea. It's one of those things that happens so stealthily that you don't really notice it, but it makes a huge difference to your wealth over the long term. Another way of looking at this is that if you had all your cash stuffed under the mattress, in 5 years, it's going to be worth 15% less. Nobody's actually come in and physically nicked 15% of your money, but you're going to be able to buy 15% less stuff with it. That's a really big deal. But by putting it in property, as well as the potential for capital growth, as well as the potential for adding value and all these wonderful things that come with property, you've more or less got an income stream that's going to steadily stay as it is forever. If you're making £200 in profit per month now, it's going to be the equivalent of £200 per month in 5, 10, 20 years. And that's an absolutely brilliant thing.
It is. We should do more of this.
Exactly. So news stories like this sound very dramatic, and it'll be used by landlords to argue that they're being punished by tax changes and this is terrible for tenants, and it'll be used by people on the other side to argue that landlords are greedy and rents must be capped and things must be done. Really, it's pretty boring. It's just fundamental economics doing exactly what you'd expect.
Builders. Such a big topic. In fact, it's a two-part topic. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. If you haven't listened to last week's episode yet, go and do that first. Last week, with Ian's help and guidance, we taught you how to get started on a build, getting ready for it, getting the right builders on site, knowing the quote is right, and negotiating a great deal. And this week, we're going to take you through what happens once they're on site. Hopefully things will go well, but it doesn't always go that way. This is property after all.
Well, it just wouldn't be any fun if things ran completely smoothly, would it? So just to refresh your memory, Ian is a builder with more than 30 years in the industry. He's worked with some of the biggest home builders in the country. He runs his own construction business, and importantly, he's an investor himself, so he's seen this from both sides. Now, of course, you're not going to be around property and construction for over 30 years without seeing your fair share of everything from hassles to outright disasters. So because this is something that so many investors are worried about before they get started, we started out by asking Ian, what happens when things go wrong?
There are lots of ways things can go wrong. So if we just focus on one for now. So you're in the property, you've scheduled the work, you've asked the guys to, part of the scheduled work is to strip all existing wallpaper off the walls, which is a common thing. So the guys strip all the wallpaper off the walls, and then you find out that 5 of the bedroom walls, the plaster's fallen off because the plaster's so old that when they strip the wallpaper off, all the plaster's fallen off. So there's 2 things to do. One is not panic. The second thing to do is to do something which perhaps may have averted it in the first place, which was to allow some sort of contingency in the price when you started with the builders. So the builders, going back to the question about how do you control the costs, and we talked about room data sheets, so something for each room. And if one of your tasks to the builder was to strip the wallpaper, chances are that some of that plaster's going to fall off. How much? Who knows? Nobody knows until you actually do the work. So the thing to allow in the costs is a contingency, i.e. a sum of money that will get spent or won't get spent. So there's the sum of money in the price that is there that you can draw upon. So it's not coming as a surprise. The biggest fear is things come as a surprise. But if you can think about the worst things that are going to happen when you're pricing the work and make a schedule, perhaps, builders will tell you what the common factors are. The things that go wrong: pulling tiles off bathrooms, plaster falls off. You find rot in bathroom floors where you have to take the joists out, or the floorboards are rotten. Things like that. If you've got some sort of contingency up front, it helps to alleviate the problem. How much you should put in is entirely up to you and your budget, but when you're purchasing a property, you need to remember some sort of contingency, because nothing's ever cost certain, because until you actually physically undertake that work, you don't know what's going to happen. There's no knowing what's going to happen. There's no knowing what's under that floor until you lift the floorboards, unless you do that before you purchase the property. Things will go wrong. Things always go wrong. It's how you react to that situation. If something goes wrong and it's not in a contingency, and you've started on the project, you've not put a contingency in, and the plaster falls off the walls, you would hope the builder rings you and say, look, we've got an issue. The plaster's fallen off the walls. And before you go any further, you'd ask him to continue stripping the wallpaper, because that's what he's down to do, and then assess the level of problem once the wallpaper's stripped. And then you can make a plan from there, whether you continue stripping the wallpaper, or whether you don't continue stripping the wallpaper, whether you plaster, whether you don't plaster. So really, there's 2 ways to deal with it. One is upfront and have some contingency, in which case it's not as much of a shock financially. The second thing to do is, if you come across it when you are doing the work and it is a surprise, then carry on with the original item of work, but then communicate with the builder. He'll say, this has happened, these are the solutions, and ask him for the costs, because there's going to have to be a remedy to that, and unfortunately there's going to be a cost to that.
I think it's really good that Ian early on said don't panic, because things are going to go wrong in property. Whether it's your first project, your 5th or your 10th, at some point, if you stick in property for long enough, particularly if you're doing refurbs, things are going to go wrong. It's just part of the game. So don't panic. Accept that it was always going to happen at some point, and now start to work on the solutions. Now, having a contingency plan in place is key. If you can, before the project starts, outline the things that could go wrong, then when they do go wrong, you're already ahead of the game. But financially, you should have a contingency as well. Whenever you price any job, you should have a contingency fund in there. Don't price your projects on them going perfect every time, because it simply won't happen. And Ian said this himself, something will always go wrong. So if you're the type of person who gets super stressed really easily, then maybe Refurbs isn't for you. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be a robot and have no emotion, but just get back in control quite quickly. If things do go wrong, there's normally a solution. It may cost you, but if you've planned for it, then that's okay. So next we asked, how can you be sure of what you're being told is right? Because the builder probably will know a lot more than you. So how do you understand what a builder is talking about?
If you don't think that you're being told the correct information, then A, you've got to go to the property and see for yourself. Or B, the builder should be sending you those updates and progress photographs, and if there's an issue, he should be, doing the WhatsApp video or giving you a call saying, come and look at this, we've got an issue, let's have a look at this together. I always try and speak to my customers in plain English. If, for example, something's happened, rather than use technical language, because it's easy to revert to what you know. If you're an accountant, you'll talk about VAT returns and CIS and all those things. But if you get away from the jargon and go back to basics, I think the thing is to go and look at the problem. You've got to go and look at the problem to see whether the scope of the problem is as big as it seems, if he's making something more out of it than it needs to be made out of. As you do more refurbs, you've got to learn. People have to learn. There's always going to be something that you wish you'd done differently, or perhaps thought, well, if I'd have gone down there and saw that, then I might have changed my decision. I think it's not dwell on that too much. It's to keep progressing. You've got to keep moving forward with that property to get it on the market, to rent, sell, whatever your outcome is. It's difficult. All right, you might be a property investor, but you might not be a construction expert, or you might not be a builder or a surveyor. But as you go through these projects, you'll get to know the common aspects of things that potentially go wrong. And you can spot most of the signs by going round in the first place with your view to look at for those sorts of things when you're going viewing the property in the first place. So things like springy floors, just rot in the floor joists. If you open the cupboards in the kitchen and the back of the kitchen cupboards is flimsy, or it looks a bit damp, or there's black mildew, if there's nobody in there, then pull the back of the kitchen off. If nobody's in the house, they want to sell it, then pull the back of the kitchen off and take a torch with you and have a look. You can spot a lot of things just by, with common sense, walking around in the first instance when you are viewing the property. But you've got to change the way you think about that property when you view it in the first instance. Or if you know a builder who's willing to go around with you, then take the builder around. That's different to a survey, obviously. That'll give you an indication. If you're making an offer of £100,000, you might change your mind and think, do you know what, I'm only actually going to offer 90 now because these floor joists, my builder thinks are rotten. So what you don't want is the numbers to be so tight that when you try and execute that building work, you've got nowhere to go with the numbers. The numbers need to be right in order for you to have a bit of comfort that what you're doing, there is some room for mistakes or for some room for unforeseen things. So don't be too tight with the numbers. There's always another deal around the corner.
This would be a big concern of mine because I'm the kind of person who likes to feel in control and know what's going on. And before I deal with someone in a certain profession, I try to read up a little bit on that profession so I can at least have a coherent conversation with them, understand what they're saying and ask the right questions. The thing with construction is it's so far from my comfort zone, I just wouldn't know what to ask. It's the same reason that I hated having work done on my car, because you go to the garage and they could just be saying anything. They could be literally making up words for car parts that wouldn't exist, and I'd be like, oh, okay, then better get that sorted and fork over the money. So if you're the kind of investor who's numbers led and doesn't have the construction knowledge, what do you do? Well, if you've got a builder like Ian who makes the effort to speak to you in plain English, then that of course helps. But either way, like Ian says, if there's something significant enough, you might actually have to go and see it for yourself and make the effort to understand what's going on. If you're a hands-off kind of investor like we are, the dream is that you just hand it all over, leave it to someone else and come back later and it's all done and not have to think about it too much. But if refurbs are going to be an important part of your business model, then it's something that you're going to need to get to understand enough about to know what you're talking about and be able to know if what the builder is telling you is right. And as you go along, the more that you do this, the more you'll learn and the more confident you'll feel for future projects. While there's like a near infinite number of things that can go wrong and it's unlikely that exactly the same thing will happen again, you will start to soak up knowledge around the subject and you'll feel more confident in future. And I think the point that Ian made at the end is really important as well. The more problems that you can anticipate, the better you're off you're going to be, because you can build that into your numbers in the purchase price. So if you can get the builder to go around and anticipate as many things as possible before you buy and make sure that that's factored into your numbers from the start, the more relaxed you're going to be because you're going to have a bit of wiggle room. Now, something that's very important when doing any kind of construction project is making sure that you're compliant so you don't get in trouble with the council later. So that involves safety certificates, it involves building regulations, and this is something that's pretty intimidating when you're new to the property game as well. So we asked Ian, what kind of certificates should you be getting and how do you go about getting them?
Obviously, there's certificates that you need. A lot of people know about gas safe certificates for boilers and appliances that use gas, and also electrical test and inspection certification. I always ask when I'm buying a property, are there any up-to-date testing and inspection certificates? And if they say no, I say, are they prepared to undertake and provide those certificates? And if they say no, then you know you're going to have to employ plumbers and electricians to test and inspect and maybe fear the worst once you've purchased that property. Once you undertake the work in that property, things like light refurbishment don't really need any certification, as in decoration, moving some internal and non-structural walls, things like that. But generally, if you are taking walls out that are load-bearing, if you're knocking a kitchen through into a dining room and it's a load-bearing wall and you need to put some steelwork in, then you need some certification from building regulations. It's easy to pick the phone up and speak to the local council, describe what you're going to do, and they will tell you whether you need to make a building regulation application. Your builder will tell you, or should tell you, if you ask him the question, does any of this work require building regs? He will say yes, no, or don't know. Generally, they have a pretty good idea. Some things, if they're not sure about, it's just as well just to ring the council. If you were just changing windows, for example, and there was nothing else needed, decoration, just change the windows because the windows were old, wooden, rotten ones and you want to put some new ones in, then you would need a fencer certification on replacement windows, which is just an insurance-backed guarantee that they've been manufactured and installed correctly. So you can either do that through fencer or you can use building control and they will do a separate visit to do windows. So building control cover pretty much everything. And if you ring them and have the conversation with them, you are able to determine what you need. But the first port of call is your builder. And then the second port of call, or even after you've spoken to your builder, is just a double check with local council building control. You can pick the phone up and they will tell you what you need to do. They will come out and, depending on what work you're doing, they'll come out and do an inspection. You ring them up and say, we're just about to do X or Y. They will come out and look to make sure that you're conforming to the regulations in that aspect that they've asked you to notify them about. So, for example, if you were putting a steel beam in, they'll come out and make sure that it's seated correctly onto the walls that it's going onto without getting too technical. So they'll do things like that. They'll cover things like that. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the local council to provide building control services. It's just like if you've got a Hyundai car, you don't need to use Hyundai to do your service, to give you the guarantee. Same with building control, you don't need to use local council to give them the building control certificate. There are accredited companies out there, and I always use an accredited company. I never use the local authority. There are accredited companies out there that will offer that same service and do the same job. They'll come out, they'll inspect, and they'll issue, upon satisfactory completion, they'll issue the certificate to say, yeah, it's all been carried out in accordance with the building regulations. Personally, as a builder, I always use an alternative to building control.
So this may not be the most exciting part of your project, but it is important. You can't bury your head in the sand or forget that you need to do this. Safety certificates, building regs, you just have to get it done. Yes, if it's a light refurb, then it probably isn't going to be an issue. But if you're starting to undertake major works, then do this. Make sure your builder is doing this too, and the people on your site are qualified. Now, if you've got somebody managing the tradespeople on the site, work with them to make sure that they are doing those checks. Eventually, over time, you hopefully build a relationship with your builder that you trust them to do this. But certainly, at the beginning, on your first few projects, just make these checks. Remember, you're on the line here. It's going to hit you in the pocket if this isn't done. You don't have to be a building expert to know that projects overrun. It seems to be just common knowledge. Builders overrun. Now, it doesn't mean it's always the builder's fault. We wanted to understand why this happened. And also, more importantly, we wanted to know from Ian on what you do when inevitably projects do overrun.
One of the reasons why things do run over time is that extra work has been found, plaster's fallen off the walls, for example, when it wasn't thought it would do when the builder priced it. So obviously that's got to be put back, so that's going to take more time. You know, we can ask for the builder to put additional resources on, put different teams of people on. It all comes down to what work he's got on at that time. If things run over time, apart from shouting, which does nobody any good, you've got to be proactive in the communication with the builder and try and ascertain some milestones going forward. If it's a 6-week program and you're on week 10 and you're only just starting to put the kitchen in, there's obviously been an issue. which you will know about as you've been going through. If you're on week 10 of an 8-week program and you're starting to decorate, then you're not going to be too far away. You've got to judge where your building process is to where you are overrunning. So, for example, if you're just fitting kitchens and you've got an 8-week program and you're at week 8, then there's obviously been some serious issues. And if you would know about that before you got to that stage. So you would know where you are in the process by going down and taking an interest. You don't want that surprise phone call because you've not been down and say, oh yeah, it's week 10, we should have finished. We've only just put the kitchen in. Whatever he says to you, why, you can't argue with that because you've not been down. So you've got to take that interest. And from the outset, I think, agreeing a timescale, we talked about having contracts, and contracts are great for tying people to timescales, but as soon as something changes, that timescale can be extended under a contract. Having a contract doesn't mean it's delivered in 8 weeks because it says they've agreed to 8 weeks. If the plaster falls off the walls and it takes another 2 weeks to put that right, legitimately they've got 2 more weeks worth of work. So that contract gets extended to 10 weeks. So it comes down to being observant as you're going through the process. Sometimes it helps if you've got a builder that understands that and you can ask up front for some sort of indication week by week. And if you've tied your payments into the milestone program, we talked about having payments tied into a schedule of work. End of week 1, finish stripping out. End of week 3, first fix electrics and first fix plumbing has been done. End of week 4, kitchens installed. End of week 6, plastering's been completed. Week 7 and 8, decoration. If you've got that idea, you've got something to monitor against. So the sooner you pick up those early warning signs as you view your WhatsApp pictures or as you go down and view your property, you're on top of that. And if you see that slipping, you can have that discussion with the builder and say, what can we do about this? How can we do this? Same with the price. If the builder's saying it's 6 to 8 weeks to do work, you've got some contingency in there. So in your mind, I would always allow a bit of contingency on the time, just as you would on the finances, because extra work means extra time. So if you've not got that contingency in place, your finances, if you're buying on finance, your finances are going to take a hit, and then you're going to be stressing, and that's not good for any relationship. So I would plan a bit contingency and work that back to your numbers when you buy the property. Have 2 weeks contingency of 2 weeks of extra finance or a month of extra finance and work that back in when you buy so that you've got your numbers lined up and the numbers aren't tight again.
This is something that I've seen in the past when I've been working on website developments. It's obviously a very different set of tasks, but it's essentially the same thing in that every step is dependent on the steps before it. So if things start running behind, it's going to have a knock-on effect on everything else, and it's hard to catch up. And any kind of delay that you get just compounds the whole way through. So like Ian says, if you get to week 8 of 8 and you're nowhere near finished, that shouldn't be a surprise to you because the warning signs will have been there much earlier. It could have been that a snag was hit in week 3, which meant that someone wasn't able to come in when they were supposed to, and then they were booked out for the next couple of weeks, and so work stopped, and you're never able to get back on track again. The important thing is if you can notice it early, then you can either do something about it or you can at least be prepared, and so you can work around it as best you can. This again is where open communication and really being on top of things and showing an interest is so important. And the other thing is, like Rob said earlier, it shouldn't be a surprise. Everybody knows, even if you've never done a project, that things do run over. They always will. However much time you allow, it will always go on a bit longer. So building in a time contingency, I think, is such an important idea. I think most people are aware that you should have a contingency in terms of money, but it's much less common to automatically build in a time contingency as well. Doing that doesn't mean that you can just relax and take it easy because you know that you've got time there, because if you do that, it'll still overrun. But it does mean that you're prepared and it's not going to have any disastrous consequences if and when that does happen. So hopefully on time and hopefully without any major disasters, we're coming towards the end of the project. That doesn't mean that you can relax yet. There's snagging to be done, there's payments to be finalised, and there's some other bits and bobs as well. So we asked Ian what you should be thinking about as a job nears the end.
Finishing any works, there's paperwork, there's keys, if it's a remote build or a remote refurb, there's things that need passing across. So first thing to do is arrange a date with the builder when he's comfortable and when you're comfortable. You want a completion date where you can come round, you can spend half a day, you can inspect the property, you can undertake a snagging list. And you can look at the documentation, the certification, the information, and he can hand all that over to you. You can then collate your list, snagging list, which is an art in itself. That could be a separate podcast. Creating a snagging list is not easy because you've got to do it objectively. But creating a snagging list, if you've gone from setting out your room data sheets, being clear on your specification, Really, it's down to the quality of the work, which, as you're going through that build process with the builder, you'll get to see that just by the way that the site's run. Is it clean and tidy? You can just tell whether that job ongoing is a good job or not, and that reflects in the quality of the finished work. But yeah, do the snagging list, go room by room, then set a mutually agreed time for completion. Now, it might be, if you've tied your builder up to keeping some retention back, we talked about that before, so maybe he's kept 3% back for 3 months, 6 months, 2 months, whatever you've agreed. It might be that you don't necessarily need to do a full snagging list until the retention is due. So what I mean by that is you've agreed with the builder to go and inspect the work at the end of the job. Everything's working, the lights are working, the dishwasher's working, the kitchen's working, all the certification and the paperwork and the boiler controls, they're all handed over. And then you set a date. Let's say you've agreed 2 months retention. So you're keeping hold of some of the builder's money for 2 months. A couple of days before that 2 months is up, or a week before that 2 months is up, you arrange to go to the premises and then do your snagging list. So things like plaster drying around windows, things not sealed, things moving. A lot of the construction products are water-based. Plaster is, timber is. All those things over time dry out. So give them a chance to dry out so that any cracks that appear can be put right. And hopefully the snagging is just mainly some decoration items. That's all it should be. Nothing major. If you start getting to things that are major, then again, that's a separate discussion. Agree the list, agree the timescale for doing the list, and it doesn't necessarily have to be done. But always arrange a date to formally accept that the build is finished, because that also triggers, then you become fully responsible back for the insurance, and that clears it off the builder's insurance. So then the snagging can be done. If you've got a retention, it can be done a week before the retention, giving him a week or 2 weeks to do that work, and then you can pay that final amount. If you haven't agreed a retention, then when you meet the builder, do your snagging list, give him a week to do it, or give him whatever he wants to do the work. You know, how long would you need to do this? 2 weeks, and then pay him the final payment upon completion of that list.
Now, Ian mentioned retention last week, and he's mentioned it again this week, and rightly so, because it's a good idea, because there's always going to be things that need finishing off. Once a builder is at the end of the job, they want to get on to the next job. And as reputable as they are, having some incentive for them to come back and finish off the bits and pieces is well worth having in place. A firm handshake and a friendly manner doesn't matter when they're on the next job. You need something to try and get them back. So that's a good way of achieving that. Many of our listeners may be unfamiliar with the term snagging, which is just checking a property over and making sure it's finished to the standard it should be. You should definitely do that. And you should do it whether it's a refurb or a new build, because projects are rarely perfect, if ever. So go and check the work that's been done, and then you'll have a checklist to work through with your builder to make sure that it is all signed off before releasing any retention or before agreeing that a job is finished. But be reasonable with them, about the timescales to get work done. So, as we found throughout part 1 and part 2, it's a two-way process, and again, good communication counts here. So finally, we wanted to end on something a bit juicy with Ian. So we wanted to ask him about disputes. These happen, and you've often seen them on TV as well, because it makes great TV. Property owners and builders do sometimes fall out, and sometimes it gets nasty. But what are you meant to do? Obviously, you don't want it to turn nasty, so prevention is better than cure. But what happens if you do fall out?
The thing to do with a dispute is, if you can't resolve it with the builder, there's no way to resolve it, and then the communication is broken down to the extent that nothing's happening, then you need to go and see a building surveyor or a construction lawyer. Because even though you've got no written contract, you do have some sort of contract by performance, and there is an undertaking to do work, and there's been an undertaking to pay for that work, so there is some sort of loose contract there.
So it's reassuring to know that there are official channels that you can use even if you haven't got a written contract. But of course, even though those channels are there, it's going to be stressful, it's going to be time consuming, and in the meantime you've got a project sitting there not finished, and so you're not going to be able to go on to realise profit from that in whatever way you plan to. So hopefully you've been communicating throughout and this won't happen. If it does, though, I think it's important to remember that being stubborn or rude is only going to cost you money. And that sounds really obvious, but I think when you're confronted with the reality, it can be easy to get emotional. And if you get emotional and you start getting angry or unreasonable, the other party's only going to dig their heels in and things are going to be far worse. If you end up having to compromise a little bit, Even though you don't think it's right, even though you're not completely happy, it's far better than getting involved in a protracted dispute that's going to cost you money and, just as importantly, take up your attention for a period of time as well.
So now you know all the steps, at least in theory anyway. The real thing is obviously where the big learning happens, but hopefully this will give you more confidence to take on your first project. Or if you've done a project already and it's not gone quite as well as expected, then hopefully this will help next time round. For me, two of the big takeaways from both parts, part 1 and part 2, is that communication is critical. It is in many areas of life, but particularly when you're doing a refurb project with a builder. And the other thing, research. Again, this covers the whole spectrum of property, but don't forget to do it here as well. Research, research, research. The more you research, the better your project is likely to go.
Another lesson that really struck me is that you really need to get involved and try to learn and be a part of this. If it's not your thing, I think it is tempting to try to find that perfect builder, the person who you can just pass things off to and never think about it again, and you come back and it's all shiny and new and ready for you to move on. However brilliant your builder, that's just not realistic. And that's important to know going in. If you just have no interest and you've got no time and you're not willing to get involved in this part of property, then you shouldn't have it as part of your strategy. I'm not saying you have to be there plastering walls yourself, but it is something that you need to really engage with. And even if it is something that intimidates you and doesn't come naturally, you will learn the more you do it. Think back to anything that you were doing for the first time. You would have been nervous, you would have felt unsure, but as you do it again and again, it just gets easier. And by doing all these things, by incorporating all the lessons that Ian's shared with us over the last 2 weeks, you're going to be in a perfect position to build up a great relationship with your builder. Most people won't do all these things. Most people will have unrealistic expectations. They'll be vague about what they require in the first place, and they'll quickly get angry when things go wrong. If you follow these tips and you are a great client, then naturally the best builders are going to be more likely to work with you and put your jobs to the front of the queue. So if refurbs are going to be a part of your strategy, that relationship is absolutely critical. So as well as having high expectations of them, set high standards yourself as well. So thank you to Ian for sharing all this information with us over the last 2 weeks. This is an absolute goldmine if refurbs are going to be part of your strategy. I'm sure you'll want to go back and listen another once or twice to make sure that you've captured everything in there, because this will really set you up for success. But of course, the real learning starts when you start doing.
So Hub Extra is on its way, but before we do, let's give a huge thank you to these wonderful hubbers and human beings who have gone through iTunes and left us 5-star reviews. So first up is Mr. Physio. Mr. Physio says, "This is the first time I've left a review on a podcast, and I listened to a few. A friend of mine recommended that I read Rich Dad Poor Dad, which has dramatically changed my thinking about finance and future stability. Therefore, I wanted to learn more, and I've been always interested in property. I found this podcast, and I've been hooked ever since. I'm currently on episode 107, so I've got lots more to catch up on. Not only has this podcast made my commute more interesting and an opportunity to learn, it's also pushed me to think more seriously about property investment and plan for the future. In September, I will be meeting Paul at R&P Properties to start the ball rolling. I cannot wait. Thank you, Rob and Rob, and keep up the excellent work, Aaron." And next up, we got Davey M, and Davey M says, "Before listening to the podcast, my dreams of financial freedom were just that, dreams. However, since I started listening to the podcast a few months ago, the wealth of knowledge has been incredible. The Robs happily share their wealth of experience, with the resource of the week being a particular highlight. I know that Trello has made me 10 times more efficient for one. However, more than knowledge is the mindset change and the realization those dreams could be turned into reality with focused goals and a dedicated strategy. I look forward to working with RMP over the next week and take those final steps of my property journey." Well, thank you so much, Mr. Physio, and thank you so much, Davey M, for those wonderful reviews. It's Hub Extra time, the part where we give you extra. This is the part of the show where we give you a resource, a tip, a quote, something to make you think a bit differently or improve your life generally. And remember, this is all backed up with our Hub Extra email that goes out every single Friday to all our Hub members. We aim to make it the most valuable email you receive every single week. So Rob, what have we got this week?
This week we've got a really useful tool if you do any kind of driving as part of your business, including your property business. We've mentioned mileage trackers in the past. It might be something you're aware of already, but this one is called Mile IQ. It's at mileiq.com. And this is something that I've seen highly recommended in several different places now because it makes the whole thing completely effortless. So basically, you keep the app constantly running. When you're driving, it detects it. And it runs in the background and works out how far you've gone and therefore how much you can claim for that against your tax. And it makes it a one-tap process to classify that drive either as a personal trip, which you can't claim, or a business trip, which you can. So this is brilliant because so many people don't bother claiming all the miles that they can do, or they underestimate how much mileage they've done because they can't prove it or they're nervous about overclaiming it and getting into trouble. But at the per mile rate that you're allowed to claim, it actually adds up to a lot of money. So this tool could be super valuable because it means that you get to make sure that you're claiming what you can claim with confidence. And the best bit is you don't even have to think about it.
So we hope you've enjoyed this two-part series, but we'd love to know what else you'd like us to cover. This two-parter was really inspired by you because you gave us this feedback that you wanted more on refurbs. So we serve you, we've delivered. But what else do you want? Let us know via our social channels. You can go to Property Hub UK on Twitter or Property Hub UK on Instagram and let us know. Rob and I are also on Twitter at Rob Benson, at Rob Dix, so you can message us there as well, and we will work on getting it made.
I'm sure you'll keep us very busy with that, but we're also busy away from the podcast. If you'd like to know what we're up to the rest of the time, then sign up for our next Discovery webinar. You can do that at thepropertyhub.net/discover. Now, it'll come as no shock to you that we will be back on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob, and then the Property Podcast once again next Thursday morning. So until then, enjoy your week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.